Hello, I'm Paul Komisarov. Welcome to Talking Reconciliation, a series of conversations with reconciliation practitioners from around the world. Our aim is to promote communication and dialogue across cultural, religious, political, and other kinds of difference. In this conversation, I'm talking with Ashish, Nandy, and Philip Darby. Ashish is a psychologist and social theorist and one of India's most prominent public intellectuals. Philip is the director of the Institute for Post-Colonial Studies in Melbourne, Australia. I started by asking Ashish and Philip to reflect upon the practices in which they are both engaged.
In work I am doing involves a study of a genocide that took place 65 years ago. And that genocide frames all India-Pakistan relations, all negotiations, all talks of reconciliation, and all talks of possible future conflicts. In that kind of a situation, one of the best way one can go about studying is to find out the way 65 years ago the genocidal process unfolded. And once we look at it closely, we find not only was it a two-sided affair, but the ground level resistance to that genocide was enormous, probably unparalleled in the history of genocides to the extent that history is available to us. I have never heard in any other genocide something like 40% of the survivors telling, as they did in our survey, that they either directly received some help from the opposition, somebody from the opposition, or alternatively they have heard of others getting such help. I believe that figure is indicative of the nature of the genocide in the sense that everybody knew that it was a two-sided affair, that while the other side suffered, your side suffered too, and while your side suffered, the other side suffered too. It is also true that people recognize that in that genocide there was ground level resistance. In every village, virtually somebody or other resisted the violence. Something you will not easily find in another instance of genocide. I try to emphasize this part of the story so that the genocide doesn't look like a one-sided affair in the way they are retold in history textbooks and in other works on the genocide. I do not believe that that kind of one-sided account is even empirically valid. And I do believe that if you go into the details, you will find that these communities accustomed to live with each other for centuries are still able to live with each other over the coming centuries. I believe that any reconciliatory process ultimately begins in the minds of people. And if we can bring to their consciousness the fact that genocide also revealed the worst of us, but also sometimes the best of us. And to that extent, I will make the future safer for my children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Philip, would you love to say a few words about your practice?
Well, I'm happy to say something about the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies, and I suppose we haven't done very much under the banner of reconciliation, but so that we don't have people who are specifically trained. But we've tried to bring together in various situations people with very different mindsets. It may be over Sri Lanka, or it may be over the Indian students being beaten up in Australia a few years ago. So we've attempted to provide a space where we can, or maybe in Timor is another case, East Timor, we've attempted to provide a space where the contending parties can address each other, but with two, I suppose, provisos, that in certain situations we haven't gone ahead because my colleague's information is that we might only inflame the situation because the parties are very reluctant even to meet. That has happened on a number of occasions. We've attempted to do things with Sri Lanka. And secondly, I think that generally we're skeptical about professionals, outsiders coming in, as it were, and taking a very active role. And we think back to work that's been done by, with respect to conflict resolution in earlier periods, by a Yale psychologist and by John Burton, an Australian who's very active in reconciliation activities, where people have been quite traumatized in confronting the other and so on, in, for example, the Northern Ireland situation. So we're cautious. We want to make that space available, but we're very cautious about having a handbook or a set of guidelines, certainly in terms of our involvement as external people to the actual conflict.
Thank you. Ashish, you've been visiting the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies for many years here, and there seems to be a very close alliance between the sense of creating a space for many discourses to come together and your own work, which includes the practice involving the conflict between Pakistan and India that you were referring to before, and other projects in which you've been working on. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on your own concept of reconciliation and how you understand the process of making sense across these different social and religious and cultural perspectives.
Reconciliation to most people, I guess, means some kind of a closure. And that closure is very difficult to attain in situations where people have died in droves and not even been given proper funeral to ritually mark a closure. Many people say that they are still pining to find out how their husbands or wives or children or brothers and sisters died in 1946-47, because there is no closure. You wait permanently for them to somewhere reappear somewhere, and some of them do reappear, and may even die before there is a closure. But apart from this, there is another kind of closure you require, because in your bitterness you often pass on to the next generation a version of the stories which you later find is not appropriate and fully true. Like, for example, I have found many of the survivors at the beginning do not want to admit that they survived because somebody from the other side helped them, because that will damage their present political position where they have taken an extremist line against the other side. No. So you have to make them conscious that everything said, that also was a very important intervention against the violence by the other side. That the person who did so often risk their lives. I know of both Muslims and Hindus who have died trying to save their neighbors. So in some sense, your attempt should be to somehow convey to the survivor, and often survivors do not need much convincing. It is their children and grandchildren they need more convincing, and that's what I found out. But we didn't study that part of the story because we didn't expect this. This was an unexpected finding.
This sounds almost like a therapeutic function of
Yes,
storytelling.
actually, I would suggest that there is a strong element of therapeutic storytelling here, and this is something in tune with what Hannah Arendt called political theorization. She called political theory another kind of storytelling, a convincing story you have to tell through all, while facing all the odds, okay, while telling it. I do believe that also that somehow or other you must counterpoise against the larger mythology of a nation state or an ethnic solidarity which is built around this kind of stories, which allows some people to claim that they killed, but killed for the sake of the nation. They killed for the sake of the community. That spell must be broken, and that can be broken only if next generation get another story built around the genocide that is not as one-sided and as negativistic as these stories usually are.
Thank you. Philip, a lot of stories are told at the Institute for Post-Colonial Studies, and a lot of the people listening to those stories are young people, younger generation. What is it that you're seeking to achieve?
Well, in some respects, I think younger generation is much more progressive. Maybe they will change as they get older. Much more progressive about issues of, most obviously, gender and sexuality, but also about oneness of a nation. Most of my students are very sceptical about the state, the Australian state, or it could be another state. They're very sceptical about the collectivity, maybe, whatever it is. So I find this enormously encouraging, especially in Australia, where we're confronted with such conservative and colonial policies. And I think the most important single job of the Institute is to provide a space for those young people to meet people like Ashish and yourself indeed, and a lot of other people, and for them to talk these things through.
Just before we close, can I pose that same question to you, Ashish? What's your end point? What's your goal? What's your aspiration? Both in relation to the project that you described at the beginning, and in relation to the larger project that you're involved in, both in India and here in Australia.
I will say this in the form of a footnote to what Philip just now talked about. I think one of the challenges people find is to convince people that a successful genocide, a war, an annihilatory weapon used against a non-military object like Hiroshima or Dresden, these brutalize not only the survivors but also brutalize the perpetrators. I think after World War II we are in a position to claim that there are no victors in a modern war. War always leaves its scars, not only on the defeated, but also on the victorious. I have not met a happy killer in my life. Not only in the case of partition violence, but in the case of many other forms of violence. Even killers who seem ideologically motivated, who first thought that they were great nationalists and killed for the purpose of saving the dignity of their community and killing a traitor of the country, like the assassins of Gandhi. I interviewed two of the assassination team. I didn't find them happy people. I found them stuck in the 1940s. I stuck in a world organized around Gandhi. I stuck paradoxically in a stage where those years frame and give meaning to their own lives, and yet they are not happy with this life. They claim that they moved out of the circle of killing, but even then that assassination frames their life. It's a very tragic ending and very pathetic end, which might sound very odd using my expression in the case of two killers of Gandhi, but that is actually the empirical fact.
Thank you. Philip, would you like to add something about what it is that you're seeking to create, and what your vision of the world that might emerge from this sort of activity would look like?
Well, this will reflect something on my own personal disciplinary background, but I would say two things uppermost in my mind. And one is to challenge the centrality of the nation state, to open up structures of governance to patterns of thought and people, everyday life. So that is the first. And the second, which is central to my disciplinary background of kind of international relations and post-colonial studies and international relations, is to challenge the whole approach to war. And of course this is tied in, and violence, but this is tied into the nation state. And I think we have to think much more seriously, and here Ashish gives so many leads to the traditions of non-violent thinking, and not dismiss this as hopeless otherworldliness.